Welcome everybody, and I hope, can you hear me at the back all right? Yep, good. So as Vicky said, I've recently published this book on Game of Thrones, and just to prove it, here is an actual copy of it. It's the one I carry around for my book talks, which is why it's full of post-it notes. And what the book is about, it's actually a journey through the world of Game of Thrones, talking about the societies, the cities, the landscape, the customs and the cultures. It's not really a fangirl discussion of what happens in the show too much, because people are very sensitive about spoilers, though there are a few spoilers in the book. So it's a kind of exploration of the world, and it was really interesting for me writing the book to find out just how much George Martin had done in terms of research. How deeply he dug down into the medieval period, into medieval history and into the medieval imagination. And one of the things I really liked about the show, when I started watching it on a plane going to New York in 2012, was this kind of feeling of rightness. So it's about the depth and the accuracy of the world building, in part for me, the thinking that's gone on here. But, of course, that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. Tonight we're talking about heroes and villains and characters. And so the argument I want to make tonight is a pretty straightforward one, that the reason why Game of Thrones is so popular, so much more popular than anything else that's come out in the last 20 years, I think, or maybe even since Lord of the Rings, is it has such great characters. And what's so interesting about them is the nuance and the subtlety that goes into morality. Nobody is really black and white exactly in the show. They'll be looking at some pretty hard test cases on the blackness and the whiteness front here. And with no disrespect to Tolkien, though I have to admit I don't like Tolkien all that much, but without disrespecting him, sorry, yeah, I have to put it out there. If it's any comfort, I really, really dislike C.S. Lewis. So Tolkien scores much better than Lewis. Yeah, well, in The Lord of the Rings, we know who the good guys are, and we know who the bad guys are. You know, Frodo has a little moment of temptation. Faramir does lose it. Dear old Sean Bean again. Yeah, brief appearance there. King Theoden is being led astray by Wormtongue, but then he wises up. The elves go around being kind of effortlessly superior to everybody. And what about the orcs? Is there just one orc, one good orc, that we could redeem, who could be the nice orc? No, the orcs have had it from the word go. But in Game of Thrones, things are very different. And if we just look at the people we meet in season 1, Ned, Jaime, Peter Baelish, who is absolutely my favourite character, but I'm not going to talk about him tonight. Cersei, I would like to talk about all of them in inordinate detail. But of course, time is limited, so I'm just going to stick to a few of them. But just in the arc of the first series, we're asked to completely rethink these characters in terms of what we make of them when we first meet them and what we think about them by the time we get to the end of season 1. In terms of complex political, human and emotional problems, facets of their character. So nobody is totally bad, but here is the trickiest case of them all. Ramsay Snow Bolton. Now he's got a nice smile, Ramsay, when he decides to use it. Those pointy teeth, I think, are a kind of warning to us. There he is, looking a bit sinister. And if we tot up the stuff that Ramsay's done, all those crimes that he's committed, the cruelty, the sadism, flaying people, such a hobby, nasty treatment of Theon, unforgivable in some ways. But both in the books and in the show, when we hear his backstory, and we hear about the way Roose treated him and the way that Roose treated his mother, we begin, I think, to understand a bit why Ramsay is the way he is. To understand, of course, is not to forgive, but it's quite interesting, I think, to compare Ramsay to Theon and to see how Theon has his moments of cruelty, has his moments of forgetting everything that's really been important to him. But in the end, although he's a bit of a snivelling wreck at the end of season 5, at least he's escaped from Ramsay's clutches, and he has begun to find his moral compass again. But if we think about this scene, this very important scene, where we really see Ramsay as he is and see him getting what he wants. The scene where Roose Bolton legitimizes him is kind of his most touching moment, I think. Does legitimizing him make everything all right? Does it make him into a secure individual now? He's not a bastard anymore. Does it get him in touch with his nicer feelings? Not so much that you would notice, I think. But if we just look at that dialogue there, from this day until your last, you are Ramsay Bolton, son of Roose Bolton, Warden of the North. You honour me. I swear I will uphold your name and tradition. I will be worthy of you, Father, I promise. This is a really important moment for Ramsay. I'm not, however, going to make the claim that Ramsay's going to get much nicer in season 6, from what I hear. Okay, so this is the worst villain I think we would probably all concede that we've got in the series. Now, Jamie, I love passionately, I have to say. My heart leaps every time he appears on the screen, even when he's kind of chained up in a cage. Very bad treatment of a medieval prisoner. No noble person would keep any nobleman in a cage for 6 months, particularly not anybody as gorgeous as Jaime Lannister, I would argue. So I do love him, but at the start of the series, he did make it pretty hard. We start off, of course, well, first of all, we start at the Wall, but the next place we go to is Winterfell, and we see all the Starks, that happy family, and we think they're going to be the heroes of the saga, and that they're the ones whose fates we're going to follow, and in some ways that's kind of true. But then along comes Robert Baratheon, the lovely Cersei there, Jaime, and Jaime makes it really pretty hard to like him. He's rude to Ned, he's condescending to Jon Snow, he calls him a bastard. There's a bit of respect for Jon Snow as well, because clearly Jaime would not fancy being up at the Wall much, I don't think. But then the next thing we know, he's pushing Bran out of the window. What a moment that is in the show. But we come to understand Jaime, just like we understand Ramsay, I think, through his history, his tortured love for Cersei. He's never slept with anybody else but Cersei, and you can see that's something that has no future. The way that Tywin treats him, Tywin bullies him unmercifully. The man is 40 years old and Tywin talks to him like he was 14. And last but not least, I think that nickname of Kingslayer, which for a man of honour hangs round his neck like an albatross. He can never get away from it. And yet we can see all the very good reasons why he did kill Mad King Aerys. I think I probably would have done if I'd been in his position. And what we see with Jaime, I think, is a really important redemptive arc. And one of the things that Martin is really interested in the show is redemption. And he says in a recent interview, one of the things I wanted to explore with Jaime, and with so many of the characters, is the whole issue of redemption. When can we be redeemed? Is redemption even possible? Is it even possible for Ramsay? That's me, that's not George R.R. Martin. But going on, he says, I don't have an answer. But when do we forgive people? I want there to be a possibility of redemption for us, because we all do terrible things. We should be able to be forgiven, because if there's no possibility of redemption, what's the answer there? And I always think that moment where Jaime, he's had that knockabout relationship with Brienne, but that moment when he goes back for her and he jumps down in the bear pit to rescue her, that's the point at which you think, yeah, Jaime is on that redemptive arc. He's on an upward curve, and that relationship between him and Brienne is one that's really central to the show, I think, when they're together. I'd like to think there's a kind of future for them, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Brienne doesn't have quite the same doggy devotion for Jaime that she has for Renly, but there's something more clear-sighted in that relationship, which is a great pleasure. Now, thinking about other villains in the show, Tywin is not a lovable guy, I think it would be fair to say, and I think we were thoroughly pleased when he came to his end, especially with that hypocritical stuff that he'd been laying on Tyrion for his pastimes. But Tywin's relationship with Arya is really touching. They really get on. Well, Arya still hates him, but Tywin is kind of nice to her, I think. And then there are other kinds of morally complex questions. We're rooting for Arya, but did she have to leave the Hound to die slowly and horribly in that way? There are those who think the hound isn't dead. I am not one of them, I think, thinking about gangrene. And here, here we have another of the more interesting heroes, the good-hearted knightly hero, the upholder of chivalry, the one who really believes in the system, to the point of being quite naive at times about what chivalry means. The only trouble with this wonderful, faithful knight is she's a girl. And her struggle for acceptance is way harder, I think, than anybody else's, even harder than Arya's. At least Arya's got an understanding father who fixes her up with sword lessons with Syrio Forel. And let's remember, Syrio Forel was the first sword of Braavos, so he is no mean fighter. And I guess saves her life when the Kingsguard come for her. And Brienne, interestingly, shares the first two letters of her name, that Br beginning, with a couple of very famous early modern female knightly figures. One is called Britomart, and she turns up in Spencer's Faerie Queen. And one is Bradamante, who turns up in Tasso's Jerusalem Liberated. But the difference between Brienne and Britomart and Bradamante is that Britomart and Bradamante are lovely, and they fall in love with knights who love them back. Is there love ahead for Brienne? Who knows? But at least she's got Renly out of her system now, let's hope. And here, perhaps this is the goodest of the good, the man that we always thought from the beginning of season 1 we were really rooting for. The good-hearted moral northerner, the one who doesn't crave the power of King's Landing, the man who keeps his promises, the man who goes to King's Landing to help his friend Robert rule the kingdom. He's about the only person in King's Landing who isn't in it for himself, and he's horrified when he discovers the truth about the parentage of the Baratheon children. But then at the same time, he's also compassionate, too compassionate. He wants to give Cersei a chance to get the kids out, save their lives. He knows what Robert would do if he knew the truth. And Ned's confrontation with Cersei in the end is what is going to kill him. His compassion then is his undoing. And we might think about that scene when he's in the dungeon with Varys kind of oiling his way in there and saying, look, we can make a deal, you can go to the wall. And Ned says, well, no, how could I do that? How could I do that and still be honourable? And Varys says, but what about your daughters? And however honourable, however upright Ned is, he loves his daughters more than anything else. And it's for that he sacrifices his honour. For that he makes the deal that he'll confess publicly to his treachery and go to the wall. But just like, I always think the way that this scene is framed in that last episode of season 1, he comes out in front of that baying crowd just like Jesus in front of Pilate. And the crowd are shouting traitor at him. And he has to stand there and say, yes, I'm a traitor. Yes, I betrayed the crown. Because he loves his daughters, because he wants to save them. And we know how this ended up. As Tyrion says, that piece of theatre is going to haunt our family for a few generations. It was a terrible mistake. Well, I could say lots more about Tyrion, who I've hardly mentioned, about all the cripples, bastards and broken things and women who George Martin says are the real heroes of his story. I could talk more about Jon Snow and his arc of finding what he needs to do with his life and maybe what he needs to do with his death, who knows? The moral education of Jon Snow is one of the show's great themes. And we could also, too, talk about Sansa's loss of idealism. And we could ask ourselves whether Sansa's finally going to start getting nasty in season 6. I do hope so. But the final point that I want to make tonight is exactly because of the moral complexity that Game of Thrones directs us time and again out of the show and back into the real world, with ever-changing but ever-relevant points of comparison. And I think, obviously, when Martin started writing the books back in the 90s, the real-world comparisons were quite different. But we just have to think of the warlocks of Qarth prepared to let Daenerys Khalasar die in the Garden of Bones outside their city and not opening the gates to help until Zarazadon intervenes for his own dubious purposes. Think about the free folk up there at the wall trying to flee climate change and its effects. Think about Dany's battle for hearts and minds with this completely alien culture in Slavers Bay. Think about having the Sons of the Harpy running riot in your city. How do you deal with urban terrorism? These are all questions which are not a million miles away from where we're standing now. So Game of Thrones, I argue, because of its heroes, because of its villains, because of its depth of characterization, it asks us to think as well as to feel. And that, for my money, is why it's the greatest fantasy series since Lord of the Rings. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you want to come up to the front and we can have a chat. But thank you.